There is a version of this story where the Spawn reboot never happens, where Todd McFarlane spends the rest of his career doing convention appearances talking about the movie that almost was, and fans keep rewatching that 1997 film with Michael Jai White and pretending the CGI does not look like a screensaver. That version of the story was entirely possible for a long time, but something shifted, and now we are sitting here in a genuinely different reality, where King Spawn is not just a title floating around in press releases, but an actual project with actual momentum behind it under the Blumhouse banner. And I want to break down everything we know and everything I think is going to happen, because this story is way more layered than most people realize. Let me start with the character himself, because I think a lot of people who are only casually familiar with Spawn do not fully understand what makes Al Simmons such a uniquely compelling figure in comics. This is not just another dark vigilante. This is a CIA assassin who was murdered by his own boss, made a literal deal with the devil to come back to Earth, and returned as a Hellspawn with a symbiotic living costume made of necroplasm with a cape that has its own intelligence and a mind of its own. The whole premise is a man who sold his soul for one more glimpse of his wife Wanda, only to find out that she moved on and married his best friend. That is tragedy on a Shakespearean level wrapped inside a monster movie. Al Simmons operates in the moral space between a weapon of hell and a force of protection for people nobody else cares about, and that tension is what makes the character work. He is not a hero in any traditional sense. He is something the underworld unleashed that decided to point itself in a different direction. Now, the 2021 comic relaunch that this movie is drawing from takes that already dense mythology and explodes it outward into something cosmic. The King Spawn run positions Al Simmons not as a street-level anti-hero haunting the alleys of New York, but as a central figure in an apocalyptic war for the literal throne of hell. This is where it gets genuinely insane in the best possible way. The story deals with prophecy, with the politics of the underworld, with forces from heaven and hell both wanting to control or destroy Spawn depending on the moment. When Blumhouse decided to attach the King Spawn title to this film, rather than just calling it Spawn, they were making a very deliberate statement about the scale they are chasing. They are not interested in the small version of this story. They are going straight for the cosmic horror epic that Marvel and DC would never greenlight because it is too religiously charged and too genuinely dark. The road to get here is one of the most chaotic development stories in modern Hollywood, and I find it genuinely fascinating to trace back. McFarlane has been trying to get this reboot made since the early 2000s, and for a long stretch he was pushing a version of the film that was almost deliberately uncommercial. His original vision was essentially a supernatural detective story set in a grimy version of 1980s New York, where Spawn himself barely appeared on screen. The idea was that Spawn would function more like a paranormal force of nature lurking in the shadows, while the story centered on Detective Twitch Williams investigating a series of murders. Jeremy Renner was reportedly in talks to play Twitch. The tonal reference point McFarlane kept circling back to was something in the vein of David Fincher's Seven, which honestly does sound incredible on paper for a very specific niche audience, but it was never going to satisfy the broader fan base that wants to see the necroplasmic chains and the living cape unleashed in full. That version of the script is now in the trash where it belongs, not because it was a bad idea, but because it was the wrong idea for the scale of what this property deserves. The King Spawn era demands something bigger. My theory about why they made this specific pivot is that Blumhouse looked at what the 2021 comic run achieved creatively and realized that jumping straight into the Cosmic War storyline actually solves several problems at once. It gives them a world that feels immediately epic. It gives them a version of the character who is operating at maximum power rather than slowly building toward it, and it gives them a visual palette that no other superhero film has touched, because we are talking about a version of hell that should feel genuinely oppressive and terrifying, not the cartoon fire and brimstone of something like Constantine. The writing team they assembled signals everything about the direction they are heading. Scott Silver is leading this project, and his screenplay work on Joker demonstrated a real understanding of how to build a character who descends into violence and madness in a way that feels psychologically coherent rather than gratuitous. Joker worked because it made you understand the internal logic of a person the world had broken, and that skill is exactly what King Spawn needs. Al Simmons has to feel like a real human tragedy underneath all the supernatural horror. Malcolm Spellman and Matt Mixon are also on the writing team, and Spellman's background in serialized Marvel television storytelling means there is someone in the room thinking about how this universe expands beyond the first film. This is not a writing team you hire if you want a generic popcorn movie. These are people brought in to build something dense with lore and genuinely uncomfortable in the ways that matter. The casting conversation is where things get particularly interesting and a little murky. Jamie Foxx has been publicly attached to the role of Al Simmons for years at this point, and his passion for the character has always seemed genuine. But there are reports circulating that Blumhouse is looking to build out an ensemble of major stars, rather than centering everything on a single lead. If that is the direction they are going, the implications are significant because the King Spawn storyline naturally supports a larger cast. You cannot tell a story about a war for the throne of hell without characters who represent different factions, different allegiances, different agendas. And if you are already thinking about a universe from the first frame, you start thinking about characters like Gunslinger Spawn, the medieval Knight Spawn, and She-Spawn, who all exist within the broader mythology. The King Spawn storyline functions as a nexus point where multiple versions of the character's legacy could theoretically intersect, and if McFarlane and Blumhouse are thinking that far ahead, we might be looking at a cinematic universe that launches fully formed rather than slowly building toward one. The director search is the piece that feels most like the final lock on the door, and the most recent information from late 2025 suggests that a contract has actually gone out to a specific unnamed director who has a background in psychological thrillers and high-concept visual storytelling. McFarlane has reportedly said he expects to have someone locked in within a matter of months, and the plan seems to be a simultaneous announcement of the director and the full studio partnership as one major press event designed to reclaim the narrative from all the years of delays and skepticism. The identity of the director is being kept extremely quiet, but the description of someone from the psychological thriller space makes complete sense for what this movie needs to be. My personal dream pick for this project, and I know this is pure speculation, would be someone like Robert Eggers, whose work on films like The Witch and The Lighthouse proves an understanding of how to use atmosphere and dread in a way where the horror lives in the texture of every scene rather than in jump scares. Spawn is fundamentally a tragedy, and you need someone who understands that the horror should feel existential, not cheap. The debate about whether skipping the traditional origin story is a mistake is something I have been going back and forth on for months. On one hand, the argument for skipping it is that origin stories have become the most exhausted format in superhero cinema, and audiences are tired of watching characters slowly discover their powers across 2 hours. On the other hand, the general public's familiarity with Spawn is genuinely limited. The 1997 film is almost 30 years old. The HBO animated series, which is legitimately one of the greatest comic adaptations ever made, remains a cult classic rather than a cultural touchstone. You cannot assume that a mainstream audience understands the weight of what Jason Wynn did to Al Simmons, or feels the specific anguish of a man who traded his soul to see his wife one more time and lost everything anyway. My theory is that they are going to use the King Spawn framing cleverly by dropping us into the story at a point where Simmons is already operating at a high level of power, but revealing his past through fragmented, nightmarish flashbacks that function almost like trauma responses rather than conventional backstory exposition. This approach would let the film feel epic and large-scale from the first frame, while still giving the audience the emotional anchors they need to actually care about what happens to him. If done correctly, those flashbacks would not feel like interruptions to the main story, but like evidence of the grief and rage that is fueling everything we see him do in the present. The tragedy of who he was and what was done to him has to be felt even if it is not shown in a linear sequence, because without that weight, the supernatural spectacle is just noise. What makes this moment in Hollywood actually feel different from all the previous Spawn announcements is the combination of factors that have aligned simultaneously. The script is reportedly locked. Blumhouse is a proven machine that knows how to market elevated horror to a wide audience without sanitizing it. McFarlane himself seems to have finally accepted that his singular vision needs to operate within a larger commercial and creative infrastructure. And the broader cultural moment is right, because superhero fatigue is genuinely real, and audiences have been starving for R-rated genre filmmaking that treats them like adults. The runaway success of Deadpool and Wolverine proved that the appetite for mature, violent, uncompromising comic book content is enormous when the execution is there. The technical challenge of doing this character justice on screen is also worth talking about, because Spawn's visual identity is fundamentally about transformation and the organic nature of his costume. The necroplasmic suit is alive. The cape responds to his emotional state. When he's at full power, the character looks like something that should not exist in a physical universe. Visual effects have come far enough that none of this is impossible, but it requires a commitment to practical effects work combined with digital enhancement rather than just drowning everything in CGI. The cape especially needs begins to feel like a character with its own presence and weight, because in the comics, it functions as almost a second protagonist. Getting that right would immediately set this apart from every other superhero film on a purely visual level. What I keep coming back to is what this film represents symbolically beyond just being another comic adaptation. If Kingspawn works, it legitimizes an entire tier of dark, morally complex, religiously charged storytelling that the major studios have been too cautious to fully commit to. The heaven versus hell mythology that Spawn operates within is one of the most interesting sandboxes in all of comics because it refuses to make either side clearly good. Heaven in the Spawn universe is not a force of unambiguous righteousness, and hell is not just evil for its own sake. Both are political entities pursuing their own agendas with Spawn trapped in the middle, and that moral ambiguity is exactly the kind of complexity that separates genuinely memorable genre cinema from entertainment that you forget 3 days later. A decade of development hell is a long time to wait for anything, but if you think about what that wait has produced, a completely rethought creative direction, a major studio partnership, a serious writing team, and a title that signals genuine ambition rather than cautious compromise, then maybe all those years of frustration were pointing towards something more worthwhile than whatever that low-budget ghost story with Detective Twitch would have been. The throne of hell has been sitting empty in cinema for a long time. Whether this movie actually delivers on the enormous potential of the Kingspawn premise remains to be seen, but the conditions for something extraordinary are there in a way they have never been before, and after everything this project has been through, that alone feels worth paying attention to.